Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, a window into the soul of the North Fork of Long Island. We'll delve into the pulse of our community, its pressing issues, promising opportunities, and the rich stories that weave our shared history. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 83, we sit down with Lucinda Hemmick, president of the Southold Indian Museum. Lucinda shares her journey from an early fascination with science and archaeology to her college years and how these passions led her to her teaching in chemistry and science research education. She reflects on her time as a high school teacher and how it eventually brought her to the Southold Indian Museum, where she took on a pivotal role as the president. Lucinda dives into the museum's history, its extensive collection, and the educational programs it offers, as well as exciting new opportunities for the museum's future. So I hope you enjoy episode 83 with Lucinda Hemmick. This episode was recorded July 25th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast today. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
And so to start off with just how you made your way out to the North Fork.
Sure. Well, my husband and I lived in Stony Brook for quite a while, and he's a physics professor at Stony Brook University, and I was teaching high school at Longwood High School. And we would be driving out here and saying, oh, how beautiful this is with all the farmland. And so we fell in love with the area and thought, oh, we'll just buy our retirement home out here. And then we moved out here, and now we've actually lived here for almost 16 years.
Wow. And so what have you been involved in the community?
So in the community here, I can actually be seen playing in the Friday night band at Mitchell Park on Friday nights. I also play organ at the Cutchogue Presbyterian Church, and sometimes I'm playing as a sub at Mattituck Presbyterian Church, where I'm with the worship team and the choir. So I love going between those two beautiful churches. I'm also in the North Fork Chorale, and I guess that's about it for now, because we'll talk about the museum in a bit.
Yes. And before getting to the museum, I was just curious about your career path coming out of high school and what you gravitated towards in your college years.
Okay, sure. So my parents were the band director and choir director at the high school. And then all of my siblings went into music as music teachers. I didn't really want to go that way because I had a big interest in science. So I wanted to do music for fun and science as my career path. So I was always interested in archaeology, but I had a really broad interest in science in general. So I always think about that phrase, you have to see it to be it. And there wasn't anything archaeology related as I was growing up, but molecular biology was getting really hot when I was in high school and college. So I decided to go and get a neurosciences degree from University of Rochester, where I specialized in opiate receptor function. And then I did postdocs in molecular neurobiology at Yale and at Stony Brook. And I really, really had a good time. It was very cool. But, there were aspects of all of the work that I was getting a little tired of, like, struggling for grant funding at the same time as you're trying to do your experiments. So at some point I decided to switch to education. So I switched over to a high school teaching career. And I just retired from 30 years of teaching chemistry and science research at Longwood High School in Middle Island.
Wow. And during that time, when did the role come about or drew you to the role of president of the Southold Indian museum?
All right, well, that's an interesting story because when you teach science research, you want the students to do projects that they pick because of their own interests. So I had a student who was collecting arrowheads, like you do, and he said, "Oh, can we do something with Native American, whatever? What kind of research can we do?" And I said, "Well, let's go find a museum." So I went out to the Southold Indian Museum to check out their collection and their educational programs, and it was so impressive. Their huge collection of artifacts, and it immediately occurred to me that we could do a lot of really interesting projects. And the one that the students were really interested in doing was focused on a Clovis point that the Southold Indian Museum had. The Clovis people were the first culture to come out on Long Island 11,000, 10,000 years ago. So these are pretty rare. And they wanted to figure out if they could take the stone of the Clovis point and analyze it at Brookhaven National Lab in a SLS2 synchrotron and figure out where the stone came from. Try to trace the lithic composition to, say, Pennsylvania, Virginia, something like that. So that's where it all started. So I asked the museum, "Can we borrow your Clovis point?" And they said yes. And this is all I knew of them at the time. So we did that whole project where we actually analyzed both the Clovis point and the Folsom point at Southold Indian Museum. And when I brought them back, I said to myself, there's a lot more that can be done here. So as the years went by, we've actually done other experiments on the soapstone origin. The soapstone is not a local stone on Long Island, but it's used to make what we call these steatite vessels from the Archaic era. And we followed up on a previous study to show that the soapstone is coming from just 2 quarries in Rhode Island. And we're actually trying to get that published right now. It's in review. And we're just finished up a study on ceramic composition, the composition of the clay that's used to make the ceramic vessels that you see at the museum, to see where on Long Island people were collecting their clay, what kind of reasons they might have had for choosing that kind of clay. And we'll be working on getting that published as well.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the establishment of the museum, how did the museum get started and its focus on Native American history?
That is another great question. So you can't run into anyone around here who doesn't have some arrowhead or fragment of an artifact that they found, because they're everywhere. So there was a group of people, the museum founders, in the early 1900s who had a great interest in archaeology and had artifact collections. So people like Roy Latham, Charles Goddard, etc. They lived in the area. Latham had the big potato farm in Orient. Goddard was a retired lawyer in Mattituck. So they got together with their similar interests and started to compare their collections and started to reach out to archaeologists to help interpret the sites, because you can have an interest in something that doesn't make you an expert. However, Latham was sort of a Renaissance man in that during his life, about every decade of his adult life, he specialized in something new. He spent a decade studying plants. He published articles about plants. He had discovered some new species. Spent a decade studying insects. Made a huge collection, published articles. And then he spent a decade looking at Native American artifacts. Published articles, got his group together. So this informal group of people said, well, we have our collections. We want to preserve these sites. We want archaeologists to come and excavate them. So why don't we formalize this by joining the New York State Archaeological Association? So that's a statewide association that has chapters all over New York State. There wasn't a chapter on Long Island, and so in 1932, the Long Island chapter of the New York State Archaeological Association began. So that was a way to sort of formalize what they were trying to do. They were networking with their fellow collectors. They were preserving sites. They were studying them. They were pulling in state archaeologists. And this went on for quite a while. And their collections grew. And they said, well, we really need to do some fundraising so we can have a museum to house these collections and give the public a chance to see them. So they saved up money for decades. And in 1962, the museum was built on the property that you see on 1080 Main Bayview Road in Southold. It's right across the street from the Custer Institute. So that building was built as a museum. The collections were moved into it, and that's where it stands today.
And in terms of the mission and vision of the museum, has that changed, or what are your missions and visions today for the museum?
Well, our official mission is research and education regarding Native American culture, and that has never changed. The education aspect of it, I would say, has expanded somewhat, though. So our number one goal would be preservation and safeguarding of important Native American sites. And the education aspect of it would be sharing that information with the public and anyone who would find that information useful. So along with having just our regular visitors, when we're open on Sunday afternoons, we have field trips for students. We have field trips for colleges. We work with archaeologists, and we're expanding into collaborations with other institutions in the Northeast because the Native American nations here, the Shinnecock and the Unkachog, are part of a general group of related nations in the Northeast.
And in terms of some of the items in the museum, could you describe some of the key artifacts or exhibits that are particularly significant to the museum's collection?
Well, before I do that, I am going to talk a little bit about the team that I work with, because no one is an island. And so over time, we're very excited to now have on our board members from the Shinnecock Nation, the Southold Town, historical societies, libraries. We have a geologist, we have an anthropologist, a historian, we have representatives from Suffolk Community College, and we have many archaeological advisors in the area. I say that before I get to your question, because when you start to say, what's your most important thing, it has to be seen through the perspective of experts. So I get the experts to talk with me, and we decide, what is the statement that we're trying to make about these artifacts, and how can we make sure that we also have a perspective from the Native American nations. So if I keep my goal on the preservation aspect, I'll talk a little bit about the Fort Korchog contact fort. This is a story that a lot of locals do know about. It was a long, hard struggle to get this site on the National Historic Registry. And that was long before my time. I will not take any credit for it, but I will describe it. A contact era fort would be a structure that was built by the Native Americans with some support from the Europeans to have a certain function, such as like a trading post, a lookout area, etc. And there was such a structure in Kutchog. So Kutchog gets its name from the Korchog nation that used to occupy that area. And Fort Korchog is on a neck of the Peconic Bay, and it was built as a trading post and a meeting area to manage some of the long-distance trading with the entire Northeast, really. You probably all heard the story of wampum being used as currency. Wasn't only used as currency, it was very important in celebrations, rituals, land transfers, things like that. But the local wampum was particularly valuable because of its proportion of blue beads. The quahog shells that we have that very, very deep blue pigment, and wampum is made from gouging out the insides of shells and making them into beads. So the purple beads were worth about 6 times the white beads. So the local wampum quality was so respected that it helped in the trade value of that at this fort. And you can see an exhibit of the original excavation of the Fort Korchog contact fort at the museum, as well as some examples of wampum and some other artifacts associated with that excavation. The way that it was assisted in getting onto the National Historic Register was really the work of Ralph Selecki, who actually grew up locally, established his career at Iraq studying Neanderthals, but then returned and was talked into re-excavating the area and helping get it established on the National Historic Registry.
Oh. Now, you mentioned briefly about educational programs, but could you talk a little bit more about how you collaborate with other organizations or institutions on the North Fork and bringing awareness and understanding about the Native American history?
Yes, we've been going through a large outreach program in the last 2 or 3 years, because there are large private collections and there are collections at historical societies and libraries. So our goal has been to unify the presentation of those into one piece. So we've been going to societies, individuals, etc., and I have an excellent photographer and videographer who works with me at the museum, Ephraim Horowitz. And our goal is to go and to photograph the collections, describe them, and try to bring them into some context of the kind of sites that we're talking about, so that they can be stitched together into a Native American occupation map of Long Island.
Mm.
So as a part of that, we go and give many lectures. We have been to the Mattituck Laurel Historical Society, the Mattituck Park District, the East End Seaport Museum, East Marion Historical Association, Oyster Ponds Historical Society, and Ephraim has been out establishing relationships with farmers who have collections. And as our goal of sort of unifying everything so that everybody can see everything in one place, we have started a book series. So we're actually just in final edits for our first book, which is going to concentrate on Long Island projectile points. So that would be the technical term for an arrowhead. As I said at the beginning, you can't really meet anyone around who hasn't found an arrowhead, either at the beach or in the earth somewhere. And so there's quite a bit of interest in that. But for us at the museum, the projectile points tell a really important story, because the type of projectile point, the shape of it, the stone it's made of, where it's found in context, can tell you an 11,000-year-old history of Long Island. Because we have projectile points in our collection and in local collections from the Paleo period to the Archaic period, sort of that 8,000 to 3,000 year old, to the Woodland period, which takes us all the way up to the Contact period. So some of the photographs that we've taken will appear in the book along with our collection, so that everyone gets to appreciate the history of those kind of artifacts on Long Island. And in the future, we hope to expand the book series to go and look into vessels and then, of course, tools. So the book, when it is finished, will be available on Amazon, and it will be called Long Island Projectile Points.
Wonderful. Oh, that sounds wonderful. And that's your first book?
That's the first of a series. They will take a while.
Yes. And also, I was just curious, with now being at the museum, what year did you start?
So when I went to borrow the Clovis and Folsom points, That was all the way back in probably 2016.
Okay.
So I didn't have any association with the museum except I wanted to borrow their stuff. And then as I visited it more and more, I saw what a great potential there was. And then I joined the board, and I spent several years as a board member. Then I started as secretary, and I gradually trickled my way up to president because a lot of the things that I was trying to accomplish and the research we were trying to do and our collaborations, it works a lot easier if I can just sort of manage all that as president of the board and have my team help me with all of the details.
And then over that time, has there been any challenges or hurdles you've had to face in preserving and promoting Native American heritage?
Well, you always have the issue as a nonprofit of maintaining your own financial existence. So that's a background struggle that we always have. It's so funny that when you tell somebody you're so excited because you just got this grant to do this project, and they're like, oh, well, you're all set then. No, a grant helps you buy new equipment and supplies and software and things like that, but it doesn't pay your bills. So like any other nonprofit, we have our regular maintenance, our insurance, etc. And so we have to keep a close eye on making sure that the museum is solvent and can go forward while we do our projects. So I think that's a struggle that every nonprofit has. And so I have to bring it up because it's something that we all share.
And I know you mentioned the book, but are there any other upcoming project or opportunities that you're particularly excited about?
Yes. We just started a collaboration with the Institute for American Indian Studies. Now, they have a very ambitious goal. I know that they can do it. They want to do a typology of ceramic vessels in the Northeast. The main archaeologist associated with the Institute, which is in Connecticut, is Dr. Lucinda Hemmick. And we've worked with her before on studying sites and characterizing them. So we're excited to get to do this additional project. So if you consider the whole Northeast, you have areas that are very well studied, Massachusetts, Connecticut, etc. And it's kind of funny that there'll be so much research work that's centered around large universities and places that have archaeological programs, like University of Connecticut. There's very excellent site work that's been done around there because that's where they are. But on Long Island, the story is kind of different. There's a lot of areas of Long Island, especially out east, that we have good information about, but it hasn't been researched at a scientific level. It's not really the amount of work being done out here as in these other areas. So doing these collaborations with the museum collection gives us a way to offer up to the Institute to photograph and learn from our records, and then integrate all of that into the Northeast so that Long Island is represented as the hub of activity that it really was. If you look at the location of Long Island in the Northeast, it immediately hits you that you could just take a canoe from there and go anywhere. And so we have all of this evidence that they were traveling and trading up to Rhode Island, Massachusetts, other areas of upstate New York, even 3,500, 4,000 years ago, wide trading networks, trading with the Ohio Adena culture. And so all of that has to be stitched together, and we're very interested in Long Island getting its place in that story.
Wonderful. And then what are your aspirations for the future of the Southold Indian Museum?
Well, I'd love to see our educational role expanded. And so in order to talk about that, I'll talk about a few projects that we are doing. We've gotten several funding opportunities with the R.D.L. Gardner Foundation. So we're very grateful for their support. The Gardner Foundation grant that is funding our work right now is to establish a digital story map of Long Island, showing Native American occupation from the beginning to now. That's a lot. And it's very helpful to have a story map because education is tending towards out of books and into a visual experience. So if you could imagine a digital story map that you could just pull up as a link on your computer, where you could just click on any part of Long Island to see what was going on there. What did the artifacts look like? Let me see some 3D scans of these artifacts. Let me look at these ancient trading paths. We're putting that together, and we're going to be finishing that project at the end of this calendar year. And there is a 2-week required curriculum for fourth graders in New York State that talks about Native American history. So in other parts of the state, they might concentrate on the upstate nations or the Iroquois, but in our part, of course, it would be the Long Island Algonquins. So we're excited to make a digital story map that might be helpful to the fourth grade teachers to actually use in the classroom as an instructional aid for when they're in that unit. So when we're done with the product, we'll go through the process of offering it to Eastern Suffolk BOCES to take a look. And we would be very excited if it eventually could be made available to the classroom teachers. And it will be just a public link, so when it is done, we would be posting that on our Facebook and our Patreon page and our website.
That sounds like a good resource.
It will be an excellent resource because it'll be very visual. There'll be information available you can click on if you want to learn more, or, if you just kind of want to see what was going on where in your neighborhood.
Yes. And also, separate from the museum, I like to ask people that come on the podcast just your thoughts on the North Fork with living out here and what you've enjoyed about living and working out here.
Well, everyone loves the area, for its bucolic nature. I mean, it is beautiful. The vineyards, the farm stands, the feeling of open air, all of the beaches. It's just beautiful naturally. And that's where that preservation piece comes in, because we're always thinking we don't really want the North Fork to become like the South Fork. I also love all of the people that I've met. Everyone is close knit. Everyone knows everybody. And it's very easy to establish these collaborations that work for the common good.
Mm-hmm. And then, was there anything else you wanted to cover or discuss that we haven't talked about?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about the interest that I hear from visitors coming to the museum. There are some common themes, and I love to talk about them. We have people visit who have read the book 1491 by Charles Mann, and it's an excellent book about what did North America and South America look like right before European contact. So we have long discussions with our visitors about how the local Native Americans managed the land. They actually had open grazing areas. They managed the growth of trees. There were a lot of aspects to land management that were witnessed by the settlers when they came. They had fishing weirs. They had a lot of what we call native technology. And there's been a push recently to try to learn from this. The challenges that we're having now, is there a way that we could be addressing them that had been done for thousands of years before the settlers ever showed up? And so we have a great interest in looking at this native technology. Another thing I wanted to bring up is the crossovers we have in history with the local historical societies. So we divide the history into pre-contact, contact, and post-contact. So the contact period is where we overlap with historical societies because we start to see goods that were traded from the Europeans, such as metal and these ceramic pipes from Amsterdam. And a very interesting point of overlap would be, say, Revolutionary War. So there are lots of people in the area that are very interested in the Revolutionary War, but some of them don't realize that the Native Americans fought on both sides and were actually officers on both sides. And they had a long history of being involved in these military conflicts. So a lot of the post-contact archaeology that's interesting is looking to see in these conflicts, what was the involvement of the Native American nations? What kind of decisions did they make? So to wrap that up, in the whaling era here in Greenport, the Shinnecock had been harpooning and pulling whales in for thousands of years, just going out in canoes. And so that was quite respected by the settlers. And so when the whaling era came about, the first people you wanted on your ship were the Shinnecocks. So they played a big role in the whaling industry because they were already expert at a lot of the things that the whaling industry was experiencing.
That's fascinating.
And
I didn't know any.
Right, and that brings us into a lot of interesting sharing of information, artifacts, and making loans to other museums like the Whaling Museum in Cold Spring Harbor. And so we can go back and forth because we have a common interest in those eras.
Absolutely. This was a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on the podcast today and share your story with coming out here and all the wonderful work you're doing in the area for promoting Native American history.
Yeah, let me say a few words about how you can contact us and see some of our work.
Sure.
Our website is southoldindianmuseum.com, and on that website is a photo gallery that was funded by Gardner Foundation. And if you just pull down the menu, you can see a large collection of photographs of our projectile points, tools, vessels, and other artifacts. And our newest photography and 3D scans, we upload on Patreon. So you can join Patreon as a sponsor and just pay a little bit per month if you want to support our work. You can also lurk on Patreon for free, so you can check it out for free. Just look up Southold Indian Museum on Patreon. And then if you want to contact us, we have many people sending us pictures of artifacts that they found, and we're able to, in most cases, look at the picture and help you out a little bit to interpret whether it's an artifact and what kind of artifact it might be. And you would email us at indianmuseum@optonline.net.
Yes, definitely support local organizations. It sounds like a wonderful program.
Well, it's really a lot of fun, and it's very gratifying to go into what we call the deep history of Long Island. Something before European settlers, and something that doesn't get discussed a lot in your textbooks.
Yes. But no, I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast today.
All right. Thank you, Chris.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 83 with Lucinda Hemmick. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.